Chapter 4. Girls like Caroline, who have just finished 15 uninterrupted years of educational routine, find themselves still dividing the year into seasons in the way they are used to, rather than by the calendar. January the 1st is not the birth of the new year. September is. Spring is not a time of hope and blossoming. It is a time of leave-taking and faint pangs of unhappiness. The year breaks in half at the end of January, which is the time of exams, panic, dirty clothes, sleepless nights, and frantic last-minute studying. It was therefore very strange to Caroline to find herself at the end of January in New York with nothing to stir her up emotionally. She had been taking home a manuscript every evening to read and report on, and although at first she had to write the comments over and over like a composition in order to make them short and to the point, she soon had the knack of it and could type her feelings directly onto the official comment sheet. The first few books she reported on, she felt as though she would never be able to be an editor, but at the end of 3 weeks, she had learned something startling and encouraging, that a thing which seems mysterious can finally become almost automatic. In fact, at the end of January, she began to feel a slight touch of resentment that Mr. Shalimar kept gobbling up her extra hours' production without ever giving her any sign of encouragement that she would be allowed to become an official reader. She had fallen into the habit of taking the 7 o'clock express to Port Blair about 3 nights a week. Those evenings, she would first stop at the Fabian bar to have a drink with Mr. Shalimar, Mike, April, and 1 or 2 or 3 of the other office girls whom Mr. Shalimar managed to take in tow. She was pretty sure that Mr. Shalimar liked her because she and April were the only regulars. She did not like him particularly. She could not quite get over her fear of him, a fear which kept her from falling into a trance when he started telling his same old stories for the benefit of each new girl. The two things which kept her accepting his invitations were her desire to become anything like a member of the inner circle and her companionable feeling for Mike Rice. She always managed to seat herself across the table from Mr. Shalimar, not next to him, so some other girl than herself would have to be the unwilling recipient of the affectionate hand. That meant she would find herself elbow to elbow with Mike. She often looked at him on the sly and had the same feeling about him as she had about April's apartment the first time she saw it, that so much could be done to improve the run-down facade. Mike had the kind of aristocratic, well-formed face and athletic, if wiry, body that it is very difficult to destroy. He seemed to be doing his best to try, though. Despite her midnight conversation with April that one night, Caroline never really thought of Mike as a romantic possibility. She wasn't quite sure how she considered him. She hoped he could someday be her friend. She knew that she trusted him, and that he represented a kind of life and a kind of world that were a mystery to her, and an interesting one. She never compared him to Eddie, nor brought up thoughts of Eddie as a defense against him. Eddie was a wound that had not yet healed, as if some important part of herself had been torn away. If she had gone out regularly with another boy, she would have been compelled to compare him with Eddie, but she did not have to compare Mike Rice with anyone. In fact, there was no one in her limited sphere whom she could have sensibly compared with Mike anyway. Preoccupied as she was with her own feelings about a situation that was still new to her, Caroline could not help noticing the slow change that was coming over April. The first indication was the morning after their first payday, when April appeared triumphantly in the bullpen with her gold hair shorn, snail-curled and lacquered. The effect, or rather the contrast, was somewhat frightening, like seeing a picture of one of those ancient Egyptian princesses quite bald without her headdress. At 5 o'clock that day, April cornered Caroline. "It's wrong, isn't it?" April said timidly. "There's still something not quite right." "It's a bit stiff," Caroline said kindly. "I wanted to look like you," April said. Tell me where you have yours done." The next day, April returned looking like a stranger, fluffy short hair, new penciled eyebrows that gave her a gammon look and some kind of pale powder base that hid the farm girl freckles. Caroline had forgotten what a really beautiful face April had, but now it was completely apparent. April was wearing a very simple black jersey dress that she had seen in one of her secondhand fashion magazines. "Well, look at the movie star," Mr. Shalimar said. April still could blush, even under the Elizabeth Arden icing. "I bought 2 more dresses and shoes and a handbag and a coat and charged the whole thing," she confided to Caroline. "I'll be paying it off for the next year." "It was worth it," Caroline said. "You look lovely, really lovely." When April smiled, her new eyebrows made her look reckless, or perhaps it was the line of the hair curving around her face. "Did you hear what he said?" "Who? Pale Hands I Love by the Shalimar?" "Oh, honestly, you're terrible," April breathed, laughing, and hurried into Mr. Shalimar's office, holding her shorthand pad in one hand and smoothing her skirt with the other. Miss Farrow had a temporary secretary, the girl Carolyn had seen sitting nervously in the reception room some weeks before. "They might as well hire a temporary girl," Mike had told Caroline. "None of them stay with her longer than a few months anyway." The girl was named Greg Adams, and she was an actress. Carolyn realized there must be thousands of actresses she had never even heard of, who make perhaps $200 a year doing walk-ons in television and bits in off-Broadway productions, and who spend the rest of their time making rounds and waiting fitfully in unavoidable temporary office work. This girl, Greg, was of medium height and slender, with the face of a 14-year-old. She had long, straight blonde hair, not the stringy kind, but the sort that swayed all in one piece when she moved quickly. She wore all the necessary makeup but lipstick, which added to the teenage look. Caroline was astonished to learn that she was 23 years old. Greg had the sort of mouth that made smoking a cigarette look somehow sinful. Miss Farrow treated her new secretary as one might treat a horse or a dog until the ASPCA caught up. She had a contempt for temporary office help, holding that by the time you taught them anything they were gone anyway, so it was a waste of time. "You know what Miss Farrow did last Friday," Mary Agnes told Caroline breathlessly. "She gave a cocktail party and invited Greg to come, and then she made Greg spend the whole evening carrying hors d'oeuvres to the guests and emptying ashtrays and making drinks. Just like a maid. Did you ever hear such a nerve? What did Greg do about it?" "Nothing," Mary Agnes said. "You're crazy," Caroline told Greg later in the ladies' room. "If you let her push you around like that, she'll do worse next time." "It's all right," Greg said sweetly. She had a very tender, little girl voice. "Afterward, before I went home, I stole 2 bottles of scotch." Caroline liked Greg, and they began to have lunch together nearly every day, often with April. Greg came from Dallas, from an upper-middle-class family, and Caroline couldn't resist asking her immediately if she knew Helen Lowe. She didn't, but she had heard of the family, of course. Greg was the youngest of 3 sisters, and she had spent most of her time in boarding schools, always alone because her nearest sister was 5 years older and was in college when Greg was starting high school. The parents had each been divorced and remarried several times. "If I ever get married," Greg told Caroline, "I'm going to stay married. I've been saying goodbye to people all my life, and I'm sick of it." The middle sister, in Texas, was 28 and starting her 3rd marriage. The oldest was divorced also. "We're not a very faithful family," Greg said. "Except me. I've got all the glue they forgot to hand out to the rest of the family, if I only had somebody to use it on." Neither Caroline, Greg, nor April seemed to be able to meet many boys in New York. Caroline managed a date every 2 weeks, mostly blind dates who were too dreadful to see again, or pass on to her friends, and Greg knew several boys from her dramatic class who had as little money as she did. Greg's mother sent her money, enough for rent on a tiny apartment, food, and some clothes, but not for the acting classes or the ballet lessons she was taking at night, which was why she had to put up with Miss Farrow at Fabian. "Look," Greg said to Caroline, "if you want to live in New York, why don't we share an apartment? I have 2 studio couches in my apartment, and we could share the rent, which is $100 a month. You could never find a decent apartment yourself for $50. When I get to be a reader and I get my raise, I will," Caroline said. "Hooray! No more cleaning LaFaro's latrines. A year away from that bitch is like 5 minutes away from anybody else." Greg lived in a second-floor walk-up over a Chinese laundry in a respectable and safe, if run-down, neighborhood. The proprietor of the laundry had a yearning for fresh air and kept the door to his establishment wide open all day, winter and summer. Walking past it to enter the house, you could hear the whoosh of the pressing machine, and on cold days, the clouds of steam rising into the air gave anyone entering Greg's apartment the feeling that he was boarding a train. Caroline didn't mind it at all, and she liked the apartment, which, being in a converted brownstone, had enormous windows from floor to ceiling with domed tops like the windows in a church. There was a tiny balcony outside each window, just large enough for several inches of grit and soot and Greg's striped alley cat, who used the balconies for his daily promenade. There was now more reason than ever to want the promotion, and Caroline began to worry about it. Mr. Shalimar's secretary had long since returned, so April was back in the typing pool and could not tell Caroline whether or not he was considering doing anything about her reports. Every afternoon, he would stop briefly at Caroline's desk and say, "Thank you for your comments. They're very useful." Once in a while, he would say, "I read your comment with interest, and I hope to God you're wrong." She didn't want to push him or appear anxious, but she began to have the fear that he was using her to do 2 jobs at once for the salary of the lesser one, and she didn't quite know what to do about it. Meanwhile, she typed up any odd work that there was no one else to do, helped the other girls, and walked past Mr. Shalimar's office whenever she could think of a good excuse to do so, not because it would do her any good, but because it made her feel better. She began to find an influx of work from Miss Farrow's office piled on her desk. She did it without question for a few days, and then one day she asked Greg, "Is this all from you?" "Not that I mind, but I have so much of my own." "Miss Farrow puts it there herself," Greg said. "Half the time I don't have enough to do. Either she really thinks I'm a moron, or else she's just partial to your brand of typing." "Partial?" said Caroline. "Now I wonder." With her regular work and Miss Farrow's additions, Caroline was rushed all day and exhausted at the end of the day, so that the manuscripts she read at night were no longer pleasure but almost a nuisance. She would have put Miss Farrow's work off as a matter of course, but every pile carried a handwritten note, "Rush," or "Today, please," or "To be done immediately." Caroline knew she wasn't any better a secretary than any of the other girls in the pool, and she began to wonder why she was the only one singled out for these extra jobs. One day, at 4:45, she was finishing up when Miss Farrow came out of her office and dropped a sheaf of letters on her desk. "These have been corrected. Will you type them, please, Miss Bender, and put them on my desk before you go home? I don't think I'll be able to finish them today, Miss Farrow." Miss Farrow's eyes narrowed. She took a deep breath. "Listen, you little bitch," she said. "You think you're a reader, but you're not. You're just another typist here, and don't you forget it. You are not an editor." She turned and walked quickly back to her office. "What did she say?" Mary Agnes said. "What did she say? You look like she hit you in the face." For a moment, Caroline was so shocked that she didn't feel anything. Then she felt like crying, and a moment later, when she figured it out, she felt like laughing. "I guess," she said to Mary Agnes, "she said I'm going to get to be a reader after all." It was odd, she thought, how quickly one could become attuned to the undercurrents of office feeling, the fears, the jealousies, the connivings, and the secret panics. It was not safe to think that anyone was unafraid. Certainly, if Mr. Shalimar was mistrustful of young ambition, then Miss Farrow must be. The girls like Mary Agnes, who had no ambition except to do their work satisfactorily, disappear at 5 o'clock on the dot, and line up at the bank on payday, were the backbone of the office, and the office could not run without them. But the company would not make money if every worker in it was like Mary Agnes, and everyone knew it from Mr. Fabian right down to Mary Agnes herself. It was the eager newcomer, the fomenter, who set the panic wheels turning, and the people like Miss Farrow were so watchful that they knew who she was before the newcomer knew it herself. It was naive of me, Caroline thought, to think that I could become an editor without stepping on someone's toes, or perhaps even on his shoulders. And here I am, without the least desire to or idea of how to begin. "Gee, that's great," Mary Agnes was saying. "And you here such a short time, too. You know, if you're going to be a reader, you don't have to do all Miss Farrow's extra work like that. You won't even have time to read for Mr. Shalimar if she keeps piling it upon you. You ought to go and tell him. I wouldn't let her get away with it." Did I say I don't have the least idea of how to begin? Caroline thought. Mary Agnes knows how to get along better than I. "You're right," she said. "Thanks, Mary Agnes." She was planning what she would say to him the next day as she went down in the elevator, carrying the evening's manuscript. She would have liked to stop to talk to him right then, but his door was closed, and she was in a hurry to meet Mrs. Nature's blind date who had finally called. She vaguely resented this boy, Alvin Wiggs, whoever he was, because his presence and his plans for her stood like a barrier between her and something which had gradually become very important in her life. The hesitant voice on the telephone that afternoon had not warmed her, nor had it promised anything, but the manuscript she hugged under her arm promised a great deal. "Now you mustn't do work every night," her mother had told her several times. "You have to go out on dates, too. All work and no play, you know." "I'd go out all right if anyone called me," she had answered. Well, now someone had called her, and he was waiting for her in front of her office building. She recognized him instantly, even though she had never seen him before. He was the one person in the crowd who looked as if he didn't know where he was going, walking nervously in and out of the revolving door, looking anxiously at every girl who came out. He was about 30, of medium height and half bald. "Caroline Bender?" he said in a loud voice as soon as she stopped. "Are you Caroline?" Several Fabian girls turned to look at him, and Caroline curiously at the sound of her name. Caroline wanted to shrink into her skin. "Yes," she said quietly. She took his arm and began to lead him down the street to a safe distance. He was looking at her from head to toe. He had moist, anxious eyes, and he seemed terrified. She let go of his arm. "You must be Alvin Wiggs," she said pleasantly. "That's me." "Well," she said. Now he was walking, leading her uptown. "We'll have dinner at Shraft's," he said. Shraft's? She thought. Where I have lunch with April and Greg every day. A tomato surprise and a strawberry soda with all those ladies and Alvin Wiggs. "Oh, is that one of your favorite restaurants?" she said. He seemed flustered. "I've never been there. But my mother goes there all the time. Don't you want to go?" "Well, I'd rather go somewhere a little more, well, darker, with music, if you don't mind." "I thought girls liked Shraft's," he said hesitantly. "You know, small portions. We'll go any place you like." Maybe he has no money, she thought. No, Mrs. Nature said he was in his father's business. They walked east toward Madison Avenue, and after passing several restaurants Caroline liked, they finally stopped. They were in front of a small, dark restaurant Caroline had heard of. which was supposed to be inexpensive and have good food. "How about this?" she said. All right. They went in, walked past the tiny bar, and were ushered to a table. They were the only people in the dining room. "Cocktail?" the waitress said. "Oh no," said Alvin. "Not for me. You don't want one, do you?" "It's only 5:15, Caroline said. "I'd like to have one first, unless you're hungry." She ordered a scotch and water, and Alvin Wiggs ordered nothing. She felt a little self-conscious drinking alone, but she knew that if she didn't, she would never be able to get through an hour with him. She looked at him and smiled brightly. "I should have brought you some of our latest books," she said. "Are you reading anything good lately?" "I don't like books," he said. "It takes me about 7 months to get through a novel. I like financial magazines." She tried again. "It's a shame you haven't found any books you liked. What was the last one you read?" "I don't remember." What interesting ice cubes those were in her glass. They had tiny bubbles in them. She had never seen ice cubes that drew her attention so. "Mrs. Nature is a nice woman, isn't she?" he said. "Yes, she is." "She's very nice. I like her." "Have you met Francine's husband?" "No," he said. "I hear he's very nice. I like Francine." "Yes," she said. "Francine's nice," he said. "Oh, we forgot Mr. Nature," Caroline thought. She wanted to laugh. It was all of 5:30. "May I have another scotch, please? Are those good?" "Yes, they're very good." "Maybe I'll try one. I don't drink much." "You'd better not." "Well, I'll try one," he said. Maybe he's just shy, she thought hopefully as Alvin downed his drink as quickly as if it were buttermilk and made a wry face. "Do you live in Port Blair?" she asked him. "Yes, I live with my parents." "Do you like that?" she asked. "Oh, I don't mind. My parents are very good. They don't even ask me anymore what time I get home at night," he said proudly. "How old are you?" "I don't think Mrs. Nature told me." 30. She had to have another scotch on that one, just one, and he joined her. Then they ordered dinner. The scotch had made her brave enough to feel she could play Sarah Bernhardt, and she decided to have a terrible headache right after dinner. "I met a famous author when I was in Europe," he said brightly, as if it had just occurred to him. "You see," she thought, "I was wrong. I should have given him a chance. He's probably got some gay, continental life behind him that I never even suspected." "Oh." "Who?" What's his name?" "Oh, Ernest Hemingway. I was sitting in a little cafe in Spain with some friends and he was sitting at another table." He colored slightly. "I asked him for his autograph." "And what happened?" "He gave it to me." She looked at him expectantly, but it seemed that was the end of his story about the meeting with the author. Good grief, she thought. Even Mr. Shalimar can do better than that. The restaurant where they were was, unfortunately, an efficient one that specialized in getting diners out in time for the theater. Besides that, they had been the first ones in the dining room. When they were drinking their coffee, Caroline looked at her watch, expecting it to be at least 9 o'clock of the following week, and found to her horror that it was only 6:30. The scotch had worn off, and she didn't quite have the courage to act sick. Could she say, "Oh, I'm just in time for the 7 o'clock express"? "I guess anyone who had you working for him would be very lucky," Alvin was saying, with moist admiration in his eyes. She felt too sorry for him to dislike him, or at least to hurt his feelings. All she wanted was to go home. Go home. Go home. Home seemed like a refuge, a beautiful place where she hadn't been for such a long time, and to go home was such a simple thing, but impossible for her right now. "I'd like an after-dinner brandy," she said. "Oh?" He seemed startled. Then he rallied. "2 brandies, miss." They served the brandy in large, lovely double brandy glasses. "Tell me about the mannequin business," she said. "I've talked enough about publishing." You would have thought she had asked him to stand up, and give an address before a crowd of hostile hundreds. He seemed to be searching his mind frantically. "Well, it's just the family business," he said at last. "It's a dot. Family business, just the family." "But what do you do? Spy? Put microfilm in their necks?" she thought. "We make mannequins for store windows. It must seem very dull to you." "Oh, no. Well, you have Dot. Such an exciting life and everything. All those authors." "Whatever you really like is exciting," she said. "Do you want to do that always, or do you want to get married?" "Can I do both?" He looked nonplussed. "I guess so. I never thought of it that way." "I'd like another brandy," she said, "and then I have to go home because there's a manuscript I must read for the office tomorrow." "It's so early," he protested. "It's a very large manuscript." "One brandy, please, miss." And the check. If there's anything I hate, she thought, it's drinking alone while someone looks at me the way he's doing now. If there's anything duller than drinking with someone you don't like, it's drinking alone and being watched by someone you don't like. "Aren't you going to join me? Please?" "Oh, Dot. All right." He downed the entire glass of brandy in 3 gulps, with that same medicine-taking look on his face. And then suddenly the wry look smoothed out, and he blinked several times. "The second one's not so bad," he said. "You get used to the taste." He raised his arm, and with an astonishing show of bravado, snapped his fingers for the waitress. "I hate people who do that," she thought, relieved to have something definite to hold against him that really was his fault, and not just an accident of personality and upbringing. "I have to go now to catch my train," she said. "I've never met such a nice girl as you," he said. "You're the nicest girl I've ever met." The waitress had appeared out of nowhere with 2 more brandies, and he drank his. "I don't want any," she said, pulling on her gloves. "We'll go," he said. "We'll go." He took her brandy and drank it too, looking a little self-conscious. "Waste it," he murmured, and then, unaccountably, giggled. She stood. "Can we go?" He fumbled with the change, and then followed her closely to the door, almost treading on her heels, like an inebriated Saint Bernard. "Don't trip," he breathed, clutching her arm. She had never had less intention of tripping, but was not sure she could say the same for him. Just as they reached the front room, she realized to her acute embarrassment that Mike Rice was sitting at the bar, alone and gazing solemnly into the mirror. She looked down into her collar, hoping he would not see her with Alvin Wiggs, the only boy Mike had ever seen her with, and what an example. It was too late. He had caught sight of her in the mirror and was swiveling around slowly on the bar stool, his eyebrows raised. "Hi," he said. He nodded at her and at Alvin and completed the turn to the business end of the bar. But she could see that he was still watching her in the mirror, his face as deadpan as ever, just a touch of amusement in his eyes. "Guess that?" said Alvin. "Shh." "Who?" "He's a writer." "Oh, introduce me. I want to meet one of your writer friends." He was pulling her back now, to the bar. "Alvin, please." "Can I buy you kids a drink?" Mike said. His pleasant tone and the reference to herself and Alvin as kids seemed to take away some of the onerousness of being here with a neurotic, balding man 10 years her senior who had gotten drunk on 4 double brandies and was determined to act 10 years old. Alvin was holding out his hand. "I want to meet a famous author. I'm Alvin Wiggs." Mike allowed his hand to be used as a hitching post and looked quizzically at Caroline. She took a deep breath. "And this is Mr. F. Scott Fitzgerald," she said. "F. Scott Fitzgerald?" said Alvin. Slowly, his face lighted up. "Oh, we studied you in college. You wrote about Dot, the 20s and things. I'm very glad to meet you." "I'm glad to meet you too," Mike said. He looked from Alvin to Caroline. "You know," Alvin said, "I thought you were dead. Isn't that awful?" "Disgraceful," Mike said solemnly. "You should be ashamed to tell me such a thing. I'm hurt." "Oh, I'm sorry," Alvin said. "Here, let me buy you a drink. I'm so glad to meet you." Mike gestured to the bartender for a round of drinks. Caroline could see that he was a well-known customer here. She wondered when he would start the round of Third Avenue saloons Mary Agnes had talked about. After midnight, probably. "Are you two old friends?" Mike asked. "We just met tonight," Caroline said. "On a blind date." She looked at him significantly. "Wasn't that lucky?" Alvin said happily. He swallowed his drink, said thickly, "'Scuse me," with a beatific smile, and lurched off in the direction of the men's room, bumping into a couple on the way. "Oh, I can't stand it," Caroline said. "I can't stand it." Despite her embarrassment, she was so relieved to see Mike. He seemed like such a sane and welcome face that she began to laugh. "What are these blind dates?" he asked curiously. "An old American institution of mismating. Haven't you ever been on one?" "No," he said with relief. "I married when I was 18. Besides, no one I knew cared whether I had a social life or not. This barbaric custom of yours must be typically Port Blair. It isn't at all. How are you going to get away from him? Will you be all right?" "It's all my fault," she said. "I made him take that first step on the lonesome road with demon rum. How was I supposed to know he was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? I really feel responsible for him now. I think I should get him safely on the train." "He's supposed to take care of you. If he can't, then ditch him." "That's kind of inconsiderate." "Oh, and was it considerate of him to take you out and act the way he's doing?" "I guess he can't help it. He has such an inferiority complex, and I think I scared him." He smiled at her, this time a smile that reached the rest of his face. It made him seem like someone she did not know. "You always make excuses for everyone, don't you?" he said. She wasn't sure whether he meant it as a compliment or just the opposite. "That's not such a bad thing, is it?" she asked. "It's bad for you." "Why? If you insist on liking the wrong person, don't tell yourself fairy tales that he's this or he's that he's pathetic, that he needs your help, that you put him on his worst behavior. Just admit you like the wrong person, but don't give yourself the wrong reasons." She looked up and saw Alvin's white face in the distance as he made his way toward them through the darkened room. She realized that she had already forgotten what he looked like. "I like that," she said. "But it certainly doesn't apply to me and Alvin. He's just someone who came into my life by accident, and he's going right out again after tonight." "I don't necessarily mean it for you and him," Mike said. "I mean it for you and anyone. It might be someone you'd get to care about, someone a lot closer to home." He was looking at her intently as he said it, and suddenly she felt, for an instant, a cold shiver pass through her. It wasn't the chill of foreboding, but rather of excitement, of the unknown, of that same unreality coming true feeling she'd had when he had told her Mr. Shalimar was afraid of her. "Who?" she said. "Who?" "It's a good thing I'm not as drunk as Alvin," Mike said, "or I might tell you and make a fool of myself." She sat there looking at him in surprise for a moment until Alvin came and jovially wedged himself in between them. But she had something to take to herself and think about, and it was enough. She felt astonished and warmed by her own feelings. Really, what had he said? Nothing. And yet it could be a great deal. All the way home on the train, sitting next to Alvin and pretending to look out the window, she found herself thinking about Mike. She let the thought of him enter her mind and stay there, uncautiously. He was nearly twice her age. He was used and bitter. As with any dissipated person, there were many things in his past life that she was sure would arouse her sympathy. A disappointment, A heartbreak, a failure, events and misfortunes that might not deserve that sympathy, but which would be sure to receive it from a girl like herself, to whom they would all be new and shocking and therefore poignant. That was what he was trying to warn her against, she was sure, and because he cared enough to warn her against him, she found herself totally disarmed. He must care about her in some way that was more than friendship, she was thinking, or he would never have said anything. The possibility of a romance between herself and Mike was the strangest thing that had ever happened to her, and yet it was beginning to seem the most natural thing in the world. She could not help but compare Mike and his sophisticated understanding of her secret thoughts with the succession of dreary boys she'd been out with since she had been graduated from college. With each of those boys, it seemed as if there was a barrier, hurled up because she was a woman and he was a man, and each wanted something from the other. It was a kind of juvenile competition. With Mike, it was as if, because he was a man and she was a woman, each had something to give to the other. She wasn't afraid of him. To her, something dangerous meant being hurt. She didn't believe there could be any other kind of danger in becoming involved with him. The hazards of a changing outlook, of a mind that could become as old as his, seemed very far away.